Yukong is finally here with her amazing fluffy tail, and she's an incredibly strong character. However, it takes some understanding of her skill kit in order to take full advantage of her. I'll be going over Yukong build recommendations, playstyles, teammates, and much more. Lastly, if you enjoy these sorts of videos, consider subscribing and leaving a like to support the video. And now let's discuss Yukong's skill kit. Yukong has an interesting skill kit as her buffs have really high percentages that your teammates can acquire. However, the buffs last for a very short duration of time. To begin with her basic attack, she just attacks the enemy, but Yukong's talent makes the basic attack enhanced in a way as it increases her toughness breaking abilities, which can incentivize using basic attacks with Yukong, especially on a certain imaginary weak knight. Yeah, I'm looking at you, Japard. In all seriousness though, her basic attack and talent combo overall is a nice bonus since having increased toughness breaking can come in crucial against enemies if you're nearly about to break the meter, but are just a little bit off. This can help with that. As for her skill, she grants roaring bowstrings to all allies, which includes herself, and this gives a massive attack increase. And it lasts for 2 ally turns. To explain the turn order, Yukong would use skill, and then the following 2 allies would use up the stack once their turn ends. Yukong does not count as ending a turn when she uses the skill initially, so it'll only be the next 2 allies' turns. Now, some key things to note is that since this ends when the allies' turns end, characters that have follow-up attacks that may occur will still be able to get this buff for every single follow-up attack they do, such as Himiko, Clara, Jingyuan, and so on. Additionally, ultimates used in between the 2 following teammates' turns won't consume the stack either. Some may be curious as to how this works with Seele and Resurgence. Since Seele gains actions within her turn, everything she does, which can be skill, Resurgence, skill again, and ultimate, then if you get Resurgence again, then you can skill again, are considered all as one turn being used up, since the additional actions do not count as her turn ending. So characters like Seele can highly take advantage of Yukong's buffs due to this. Her ultimate also gives massive buffs as it increases your crit rate and crit damage by quite a lot if Roaring Bowstrings is active. Your skill stacks will need to be active prior to the usage of your ultimate, otherwise it won't trigger the additional buffs, unless you have Eidolons 6, as it can allow her to gain a stack when she uses her ultimate, but I'll get into Eidolons later. A nice thing to note is that Yukong gains the buffs from the crit rate and crit damage before she attacks using her ultimate, which means Yukong herself can be an amazing sub DPS, which is what I actually use mine for. Her ultimate has a lot of potential as your DPS characters that lack crit rate and crit damage can highly take advantage of Yukong's buffs to skyrocket their damage potential. As for her technique, she's able to run super fast like a certain hedgehog we know of, and she starts off the battle with her bowstrings. This can be good if your Yukong does not have enough speed to be first in the turn order, or you're running a slower Yukong. Overall, her base skill kit is very nice, and now let's go over her traces. Her first trace allows her to resist a debuff application every few turns, which is very nice as her being crowd controlled can possibly mess up your rotations with Yukong, and having her in proper or kind of optimal rotations is very crucial to success with this character. Her next trace increases the imaginary damage of all allies, which can increase her own imaginary damage, and other characters as well, such as Welt or even Luocha. Her last trace is that when Roaring Bowstrings is active, she regenerates more energy each time an ally takes action. This is nice as Yukong can regenerate more energy as her ultimate takes up quite a lot of energy, as it is one of the higher energy costs within the game, being 130. Her sub traces are nice as they can increase her imaginary damage by a decent amount, which makes sub DPS Yukong an even more viable option. Speaking of sub DPS Yukong, now let's discuss her build. Also, before we get into the next section, just as a question of the day, what is your favorite fruit or vegetable? Just super random question, just want to know. Let me know in the comments down below, and now let's carry on. Yukong can take advantage of a few builds, which can be Musketeer of Wildwheat, Wastelander of the Banyan Tree, Guard of the Withering Snow, and Thief of the Shooting Meteor. For the Musketeer set, you can either do 2-piece with the Wastelander, or 2-piece with the Thief of Shooting Meteor, or the full-on 4-piece. Musketeer is good for increasing Yukong's attack, speed, and enhancing her basic attack further. The set is also quite universal, so a lot of your teammates can take advantage of it, which is a plus for grinding purposes. Now for the Wastelander set, I personally like this set, which you can do that 2-piece Musketeer and 2-piece Wastelander, or even 4-piece Wastelander. I use 4-piece Wastelander, but this set requires enemies to be debuffed and imprisoned for the extra crit rate and damage. This set is good if you have a character like Welt, as he can imprison enemies quite often, so Yukong can take advantage of the bonus crit rate and crit damage. My Yukong does have a bit of lower crit rate, so while her ultimate does give her crit rate, I do appreciate the additional crit to do more damage when I am able to have a critical hit, and to increase my frequency of actually landing that critical hit on the enemy. For the break set, I'd recommend this primarily if you're looking into a break Yukong, and since her basic attack has enhanced toughness breaking, she could be a pretty good character for break potential. As for the Guard of Wuthering Snow set, this set is nice for more survivability on a support Yukong. For planner sets, I'd recommend Space Sailing, Fleet of the Ageless, Inert Salcedo, and possibly the Energy Regen set in order to use her ultimate more frequently. Space Sailing and Inert are primarily for sub DPS Yukong, as they can allow for more attack or crit rate depending on what you choose, and her ultimate does give her crit, so now she could possibly take advantage of having her ultimate do more damage. The Fleet and the Energy set are just good for increasing your team's attack overall, or getting your ultimate quicker to give your allies the buffs through her ultimate. As for the main stats on Body Piece, I'd recommend crit rate, crit damage, or attack for sub DPS Yukong, and if you primarily want her to be a supportive Yukong, you can consider a defensive Body Piece just to have a bit of increased survivability, but I would probably still go for one of the crits and attacks if it was me personally. As for boots, attack or speed is pretty good, but I recommend speed over attack personally. The sphere imaginary damage, but if you don't have that, then attack will be okay until you get imaginary damage. As for the link group, attack, break, or energy regen would be best, and of course this depends on what kind of Yukong you are trying to build. As for substats, I'd recommend attack, speed, crit rate or crit damage, break, and if you want a supportive Yukong, possibly even defensive stats for sustain. Overall, all these options are great, it just depends on, once again, what you want your Yukong to do damage potential wise or supportive potential wise. Of course though, a character isn't complete without their light cones, so let's go over that to finalize her build. For Yukong's light cones, I recommend most of them, as you can see here, due to her potential in the ways you can build her. The best support light cones would be Meshing Cogs, Dance Dance Dance, Carve the Moon, Weave the Clouds, But the Battle Isn't Over, and Past and Future. For Battle Isn't Over and Past and Future, these light cones will be best when Yukong acts prior to your main DPS. Meshing Cogs is a good option as well for more energy, however just keep in mind the base stats are quite lower than the 4-star and even 5-star option. As for offensive Yukong or a break Yukong, I recommend Memories of the Past, But the Battle Isn't Over, and Crave the Moon, Weave the Clouds. I recommend Memories for a break Yukong primarily, and the 2 other light cones for the additional bonuses they give Yukong, which can either be energy regeneration through the Bronya light cone, and with Carve the Moon, Weave the Cloud, either an attack increase for all allies, crit damage increase, or the energy as well. The benefit of Carve the Moon is that all allies, including Yukong, get the buff, so I personally favor it quite a lot, and I'm currently using this on my own Yukong. Now that we've gone over how to build Yukong, let's discuss her playstyle. As for Yukong's playstyle, you want to prioritize having bowstrings active as frequently as possible, which can result in her being quite skill point hungry without some form of speed investment. Slow Yukong can work if you use her technique at the start of battle, but one thing to note about her technique is that she needs to attack the enemy to have the effect active in battle. As a result, you cannot use techniques like Zeala's, Silverwolf's, and so on with Yukong's techniques. You have to decide what technique you actually want to use the most to begin the battle. As for fast Yukong, you'd ideally want her to act before your main DPS and sub DPS, so let's use Yukong, Zeala, and Silverwolf as the example. You'd want Yukong to go first, use skill to activate Roaring Bowstrings, and now Silverwolf and Zeala will have the buffs that they could take advantage of, which is the attack increase that Yukong provides. As for her ultimate, if it's ready, ideally you'd want to use it while Bowstrings is active to take advantage of the crit buffs for her own personal damage and for your teammates. Yukong isn't per se overly complicated in my eyes, however she will require some speed tuning in your team to ensure that the right characters get the buffs they desire. I personally enjoy a faster Yukong as it allows me to skill in the basic attack at the end of some turns, or if my DPS gains speed, which some do through their skill kits, prime example is Zila, then I can skill at the end of the turn, and my DPS, if they do outspeed Yukong the following turn, will still have that buff since I used the skill at the end of that turn, which is really nice to have as well. One thing to note is that the crit rate and crit damage bonus does not have a turn limit, but rather it remains as long as bowstrings is active. Which is a nice thing to think about, is that possibly having more effective crit rate and crit damage bonus uptime is possible in that sense. Io and I have discussed this quite a lot, and it can possibly open more doors for more possibilities in team synergies and comps as a whole. Overall though, Yukong is a bit harder to use, but once you have the right team synergy, she will be amazing on your team. And speaking of teams, let's discuss that next. Some team members and team comps I can see being nice is Zila, Clara, Arlen, Jingyuin, Welt, Luocha, and so on. For Clara, a Luocha, Clara, and Yukong team has incredible potential, as you can buff Clara with Yukong, and since follow-up attacks do not count as turns, Clara can have a massive buff from what Yukong is able to provide, and Luocha's field can allow Clara to constantly heal the team. As for Zila, Yukong can buff her quite well overall, but I'd still possibly recommend Bronya over Yukong in the case of a partner for Zila, but that's just my personal thoughts on that. If you do not have Bronya though, Yukong is still quite a good partner overall. As for Jingyuin, he could take advantage of the attack and crit buffs, where he can use those buffs if they remain when Lightning Lord strikes, as that'll create a strong synergy overall, and possibly using Tingyu, Yukong, and Jingyuin together can work. I feel like Welt is a very nice partner on the Yukong team as well, especially if you're using the Wastelander sets I mentioned previously, because then Yukong can take advantage of the set better with the 4-piece due to Welt's ability to debuff and imprison enemies quite often. So overall, these two are really good teammates, and Yukong can actually buff up Welt quite a lot as well, so they both benefit each other. As a whole, Yukong is a great buffer to have with her high percentage buffs, which a lot of characters can appreciate. Lastly, let's discuss Eidolons. So you may be wondering, since we get Yukong for free in 1.2, should you pull for her now and get Eidolons or not? I personally think Yukong has pretty good Eidolons. E1 is good for starting a fight with more speed for about 2 turns. E2 is nice for more energy gain for her ultimate being more consistent. E4 is really good for the damage bonus, which sub DPS Yukong can definitely take advantage of. And E6 makes her ultimate requirement far easier, as now she gains a stack of bowstrings from using her ultimate, so she'll be able to always get those crit bonuses for your team members and her own strike, which helps her own damage potential even further. If you do have E6, a possible rotation can be skill, teammate goes, ultimate, which then would refresh your bowstrings, then teammate goes again, and this will allow for a longer uptime on your bowstrings, and it would be better in this case if your sub DPS actually went after the skill so that your main DPS gets the ultimate crit bonus. This rotation would be nice overall for E6, and if you do have an intention to pull for it, this is just overall an idea. Of course though, some characters' skill kits make them go faster in turn cycles, so that can possibly mess up this rotation if you will, but it may still work if that character goes again in the turn cycle, since if it's main DPS, Yukong skill, teammate, Yukong ultimate, and keep in mind when she ultimates, because she's gaining a stack of roaring bowstrings, she will now be back at 2 stacks. Teammate, and then main DPS again. Then the DPS would still be able to take advantage of the buff. Of course though, if your teammates have damaging ultimates ready, using them after Yukong's ultimate would also be ideal. That'll be all though for my Yukong guide, and if you did enjoy, make sure to leave a like, comment if you got Yukong or plan to use her once we get her for free in 1.2, and what character are you guys currently building in Star Rail? I'd love to know, and lastly subscribe for more Star Rail content. I hope you all have a good one. Peace.